Welcome to this explainer. Okay, if you have ever stared at your digital SLR camera and felt, well, a little intimidated by all the buttons, dials, and menus, trust me, you're absolutely not alone. Today, we're diving straight in to demystify all that hardware and focus squarely on the holy grail of photography, mastering manual mode. Let's graduate from auto and get you full creative control. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with going beyond point and shoot, then we'll break down the exposure triangle, move on to entering manual mode, and finally wrap up with avoiding exposure mistakes. Now, this brilliantly captures our core mission today. This quote from our source over at Visual Education really hits the nail on the head. Basically, for any given photo, there is really only one truly correct level of exposure, but there are hundreds of creative ways to get there. If we want to actively direct our photography, rather than just crossing our fingers and hoping for the best, we absolutely must master this fundamental concept. Okay, Section 1, Beyond Point and Shoot, graduating from guide mode. Look, if your camera has basically been living in auto or those preset scene modes like portrait, that is totally fine. They are fantastic safety nets. But here's the thing. The camera is really just guessing what you want. True artistry actually begins when you take the wheel yourself. Stepping up to those creative DSLR options means you're putting the aperture and shutter speed under your own direct control. It's a real game changer. Moving right along to Section 2, the exposure triangle, the foundation of photography. So the exposure triangle is made up of three interconnected pillars. The first one is aperture. Think of aperture simply as the physical opening in your lens that allows light to pass through to the sensor. It's measured in these things called f-stops. It's actually exactly like the pupil of your eye. The lower the f-stop number, the wider the opening is, letting in an absolute flood of light. On the flip side, a high f-stop gives you a really narrow opening, kind of like squinting in the bright, harsh sun. And the creative impact here is just massive. Notice how using a large aperture, like say f5.6, beautifully softens and completely melts away the background behind a subject like a flower. We call that a shallow depth of field. But compare that to using a small aperture, a really high f-stop like f22, that brings almost everything from the immediate foreground all the way to the distant background right into razor-sharp focus. Right, onto our second pillar, shutter speed. This is literally the length of time your camera's shutter stays open when you take a photo. It acts as your motion control. A super fast shutter speed, measured in tiny fractions of a second, gives you a short exposure that freezes a fast-moving object dead in its tracks. Conversely, a slow shutter speed creates a long exposure. This gives you that gorgeous, intentional motion blur, like when you capture silky, flowing water. Finally, our third pillar is ISO. ISO is just a measurement of your camera sensor's physical sensitivity to light. A low setting, like ISO 100, means your camera isn't very sensitive, which is absolutely perfect for a bright, sunny day. But if you crank it up to a high setting, like 1600 or even 6400, it makes your camera hypersensitive. That is exactly what you need to pull in details when you're shooting in really dark or low-light environments. But here is the absolute golden rule of the exposure triangle. Interconnected balance. It's a constant juggling act. Because these three sides work together to control the total amount of light hitting the sensor, if you tweak one side of the triangle, you literally must adjust one or both of the other sides to keep your image perfectly exposed. Want to open the aperture super wide to blur out a background? Well, you'll likely need a much faster shutter speed to compensate. Otherwise, you're going to completely blow out the image with way too much light. Let's get into Section 3. Entering manual mode. Theory to practice. All right, this brings us to what I consider the most empowering dial on your whole device. You've got your programmed auto modes, your priority modes, sure, but we want to focus entirely on that M. When you grab that dial and physically rotate it to M for manual, you are officially stepping away from the camera making those creative choices for you. Boom! You suddenly have full independent control over both your shutter speed and your aperture. Now, operating in manual mode isn't some dark art. It's literally just a repeatable three-step routine. Step 1, switch that dial to M. Step 2, dial in your aperture and shutter speed based on the creative vision you have for the shot. And Step 3, frame it up, focus, and take the picture. That's the whole shebang. So the real secret sauce for Step 2 is keeping your eye on the exposure indicator. It's that little balance scale on your digital screen or right there inside your viewfinder, the one with the minus on one side and the plus on the other. When you're in manual mode, your goal is to tweak your command dials until that little marker balances perfectly right in the middle at 0. When it hits 0, that's your camera telling you, hey, based on the lighting right now, this exposure is spot on.
Moving to our final part, Section 4, Avoiding Exposure Mistakes, Common Pitfalls.
Of course, taking off those training wheels means you're probably going to wobble a bit at first. There are 3 major pitfalls you'll inevitably run into when you start manually balancing the exposure triangle yourself. First up is overexposure. That's when you've accidentally let way too much light hit the sensor, leaving your image looking totally washed out and overwhelmingly bright. The second is underexposure, meaning there just isn't enough light, so your photo comes out dark and all those lovely shadow details are completely lost. And the third is high ISO noise, which just makes your image look incredibly grainy and low quality. So, how do we fix these? Well, you just apply those cause and effect rules we talked about earlier. If your shot is overexposed and too bright, you've got to reduce the light. You can do that by speeding up your shutter or picking a higher f-stop value to narrow that aperture. On the flip side, if your image is underexposed and way too dark, you do the exact opposite. Slow down that shutter speed to let light pour in longer, or drop the f-stop value to open the lens up wider. Now, about that third mistake, the grainy photos. If you only remember one practical tip from this entire explainer today, please let it be this. Always try to use the lowest ISO setting possible for the lighting conditions you're in. It's super common for beginners to just assume more sensitivity is better and crank the ISO way up. But leaning on a high ISO instead of actually balancing your aperture and shutter speed, that's going to kill your image quality. It introduces heavy digital noise and grain that can absolutely ruin what would have otherwise been a spectacular shot.
Honestly, once you truly understand this triangle, you really won't want to settle for the camera's wild guesses ever again. You hold the creative keys now. So, with your dial firmly set to M, I'll leave you with this final thought. What hidden, beautiful details in your everyday world are you going to capture now that you finally dictate the light?